So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the English and the arrival of the first Africans. And I call them Drake's Regiment. And there are roughly 700 Africans that were involved with Sir Francis Drake. Most people are familiar with the Lost Colony. If you ask about the Lost Colony of 1587, most people know about the hundred and some whites who were left on Roanoke Island who disappeared, and it's been one of the great mysteries in American history and in North Carolina history as to what happened to those people. But very few people know that a year prior to that, that Sir Francis Drake brought over 700 Africans. A regiment is 700 roughly, but somewhere between 300 and 600 Africans whom he had employed to fight for England against the Spanish, and had used to raid islands in the Spanish Caribbean and attack Spanish ships all through Cuba, the Lesser Antilles, Florida, Fort St. Augustine's, and even in parts of South Carolina. And then as a reward for their service, brought them to and released them in eastern North Carolina on Roanoke Island. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the English in eastern North Carolina, most people understand that the English, Ralph Lane and John White, explored and mapped eastern North Carolina. This is a recreation of one of their early maps, which was shown in part one. So they knew a good deal about the native peoples in the coastal areas in northeastern North Carolina, in and around the Great Dismal Swamp area, and even to the south of the Albemarle Sound, in and around the Alligator Swamp. And so they made contact with native peoples, as I mentioned before, spread disease, which ended up ravaging native communities, but they mapped villages and had some understanding of the native people. In rowing up the Roanoke River, this is a highlight of Bertie County, and to the south of Bertie County is the Roanoke River. And Ralph Lane and his expedition went up the Roanoke River. They were attacked by the Tuscarora Indians who lived in that part of Bertie County and in eastern North Carolina. They had no interest in allowing the English to explore and gather intelligence about their area and about their villages. And so they attacked them and drove them back out to Roanoke Island. This is well documented. We know that they fled to the island. We know they kind of prepared for another attack, but Drake arrives, shortly after this, and he basically picks up the explorers and he releases these Africans, on the island and in eastern North Carolina, and he sails back to England with these early explorers who had really agitated the local Indians as well as devastated the local Indian populations from their spread of disease. Next slide, please. This is a recreation of the attack on Lane's expedition on the Roanoke River. Next slide, please. And these, again, the Africans that were released on Roanoke Island, most of these Africans, as I said, between 300 and 600, regiment is 700, and he created basically an African regiment. Most of these Africans were armed. They were given guns, and they used their guns to fight for England. And so when these Africans were released on Roanoke Island, one of the things that we see happening is that these Africans have weapons, they have, training, and they are prepared to exist in this hostile landscape. In fact, many of these Africans were Maroons, what we call runaway slaves, throughout the Spanish Caribbean and throughout the Americas. And they had lived in very harsh conditions in swamps and in the mountainous areas of the Lesser Antilles and Greater Antilles and Florida. And so when they were introduced into eastern North Carolina with their weapons, they were actually given a tactical advantage over the native populations that were there. And then you have to also remember that those native populations had been decimated by diseases that were spread by the early explorers. As I mentioned in my previous presentation, wherever the English went to try to interact with and trade with the native peoples there in eastern North Carolina, they brought disease. And before they left, or as they were leaving, hundreds of native people began to die, the old, the young, from different diseases that the Europeans had brought. And this became so bad that when the native people saw the English sailing up the various waterways in eastern North Carolina to try to make contact with their villages, they abandoned their villages and they ran away. They did not want to have any contact with the English because they saw them as harbingers of death. And so when we get to the Tuscaroras on the Roanoke River, again, that is their reaction to the English coming into their territory. Not only did they not want them to explore and understand anything about their territory, but they also were very aware of the fact that they had brought disease. Now, this is important, and I'll move quickly. When we talk about the introduction of the Africans and the fact that the Africans are well armed, and the fact that the Africans were accustomed to living in swamps and in hostile environments because they had done so in the Caribbean, in places like Cuba, places like Puerto Rico and Jamaica, as well as Florida. So the environment in Eastern North Carolina was nothing that they were not familiar with, and they certainly knew how to navigate it. And we will see that and see the impact that they have on native peoples, because as I mentioned before, many of the Indians, like the Machapungas, the Bear River, the Mattamuskeet, these Indians did not exist in the earliest maps and drawings that were done by John White of Eastern North Carolina. They come into existence later in the 1600s and at the time of the Tuscarora War. And many of these native peoples basically are Black Indians, and they appear to be a Black in appearance. Many of the remnants of those Indians still exist in Hyde County and throughout Eastern North Carolina and Pasquotank and Perquimans. Some have, identified themselves as African Americans. Others still identify themselves as Indian, and they are still, the descendants of these people are still scattered throughout Eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. This is a drawing of that voyage that we just talked about. If you look to the northeast of your map, or the right top corner of your map, you'll see a fleet of ships returning from the New World, but that fleet of ship left, went along the coast of Portugal, along the west coast of Africa. If you follow the line coming from England, you see the fleet in the Atlantic Ocean approaching the Lesser Antilles, the Spanish islands in the Lesser Antilles. And then, of course, you see the route that they took through the Lesser Antilles, attacking Spanish islands, attacking Spanish ships, attacking Florida, Fort St. Augustine, Florida, and then going up the coast of North Carolina, and then returning to England. On this voyage, with these African soldiers that they picked up in the Caribbean and promising them their freedom if they would fight for England, the English amassed a fortune. They took gold, they took silver, precious, all types of precious metals and precious stones. And when they arrived back in England, the wealth that they extracted from the Spanish colonies in the Americas was used by the English government to build the British Navy and basically enrich and build the British Empire and their future, exploits in the Americas. So it's a story that's not talked about. There's a lot of North Carolina history and a lot of history with Native and African peoples that has been left out and we haven't really discussed. Traditionally, scholars said, well, these people must have died, when they arrived in the Americas. But as I've tried to outline for you, based on their background and their immunity to diseases like malaria and smallpox, these Africans obviously survived in Eastern North Carolina, and you can see the impact that they had on the various Native peoples in Eastern North Carolina. Next slide, please. It's also important to understand that in this group of Africans that there was a mix of people. There were some Jews, there were some Muslims, there were some Moors. Moors are North Africans, and there were West Africans. So there were numbers of different peoples, including Native Americans from the Caribbean, from places like Puerto Rico and Cuba, all of whom were trying to escape the oppression of the Spanish in the Spanish colonies, and who were very willing to join the English and assist the English in their assaults on the Spanish in North America. A lot of people forget that the Muslims and the Moors occupied Portugal and Spain for centuries before they were able to unite themselves under Catholicism and expel them. And they were able to do that with the assistance of Moors. And I always point back to Shakespeare's in the opera Othello, and the play and the opera about the African general who helped the Spanish in their campaigns. So the Spaniards were quite familiar with Africans, and the English didn't have quite as much familiarity, but they did become familiar with them. But they were seen as soldiers, and they were basically used by the Spanish and then later by the English to get a foothold in North America.